Hello students! In this video, we're going to have a look at some common chord progressions and how to use them. Chord progressions are sequences of chords, and you might have heard the term, for example, 4-chord progression or 4-chord songs, which is a term used for songs using the progression C, G, A minor, or F, for example, which sounds like this. Another common progression is this one. But these are not the only ones. There's a series of common and successful chord progressions out there, and we're going to have a look at a few of them in this video. Let's look at some of the ones I have right here. I've been picking 6 chord progressions that I both like and that you hear fairly often in film scores and other themes for both games or trailer music and so on. So the first one we have here is the classic 4-chord progression and looks like this. Now, I've been recording everything in string chords here, so let's just have a listen. So this is a very common chord progression and is very effective and will sound good most of the time. The dangerous thing though is that it's so common that it might sound a little bit cliche when you overuse it. So be careful when you use progressions like this and try to make them your own to a certain degree, which is something we're going to have a look at very soon. But let's skip to this one. The next progression looks like this. It's also really simple. It's just 3 chords going down and then up again. Let's just play around with it for a little second here. And bear in mind, I'm just improvising a few melodies over them so you can get a feel for how they might sound when you put melodies to them. So I'm just going to play around with all of these so you can get a feel for them. Next up, we have this one, which sounds like this. And as you might have guessed, this sounds very familiar for those who have seen the movie Inception or listened to the soundtrack from Inception from Hans Zimmer, especially Time, which basically is based around this little chord progression throughout the entire theme. This is basically the motif the entire cue is built on. So it's a nice chord progression that I really like. Let's play around with that one for a little minute as well. So yeah, also a nice chord progression. Let's move on to the next one, which looks like this. And this is what it sounds like. Also fairly straightforward, nothing special really. Let's play around with it so you can see what it sounds like when applied to a song. And so on. Now we're getting to number 5, which is this one. And it sounds like this. Now, this is also one of the common 4-chord progressions. It goes just like this, which is the foundation for thousands and thousands of songs. So again, when you use this one, you risk sounding a little bit too cliche or using chord progressions that sounds overused. But if you like create an arrangement that is interesting and unique, or your melodies or the way you present it, then you're gonna be safe. But yeah, keep that in mind when you're using these chord progressions, because they might end up sounding a little bit too uninteresting sometimes. Again, when you use them in a good way, you might end up with some really, really good results. Now, let's just play around with this one as well. And so on. Now we have the final chord progression, which is also a fairly common one. Let's just listen to it and have a look right here. So those are 6 fairly common and effective chord progressions that you can use in your tracks. For example, if you want some kind of harmonic foundation to get some inspiration to create melodies, something to just play around with, or if you're stuck with a writer's block. Now, a few ways to use chord progressions is to find chord progressions like these ones that are fairly common, or you can take a track that you like, some kind of soundtrack or a trailer music track or a song, and take the chord progressions in there and transform them into your own, or use them in your own tracks, because there's only a certain amount of chords, strictly speaking. So don't be afraid of quote unquote stealing chord progressions from other songs, because it is all about the way you use them in your songs that's gonna make the big difference. But using chord progressions can be a good way to get started and get good results quickly. Now, let's look at some ways that you can make chord progressions more of your own. So I'm gonna take one of these ones that we can use as an example, and let's, for example, take, I'd say, let's take this one, the first one, and let's just place it over here and look at some ways we can tweak this to sound a little bit different if that's what we're going for. So one interesting way to use chord progressions is to change the rhythm of the chord changes. Because in the initial presentation of these progressions, you can see that the chords are changing for every measure here. So that's fairly just straightforward. But what if we change this? So, for example, let's try one thing, which is making the chord changes come earlier. I'm just going to re-record this in a different way, and we're going to keep this for reference. And I forgot to hit record, but that's what you have this feature for, retrospective MIDI record. So that's a lifesaver sometimes when you play something amazing, but you forgot to hit record. So that's a good tip right there. Now, let's also just put in a bass line real quick. So that's one way to change the chord progressions to something different, is to changing the rhythm of the chord changes. You can see here I've been shortening down the first ones, or the first and the third one, while making the second and the fourth ones a lot longer. And this can be an interesting way to change the feel and the rhythm of the chord progressions. You can also do it the other way around. So it sounds like this. And again, let's do the bass line. So here you have 3 different ways to change the rhythm and the pace of the changes in the chord progressions to make them sound different. So from each chord progression, you can get a whole lot of different results out of them when you start tweaking them like this. So that's changing the rhythm. Let's look at some different ways to make the chord progressions a bit more unique and our own. So what we looked at in one of the earlier videos is substituting chords. Now, if we take this chord progression right here, or actually let's take a different one. Let's take, say, just a random one. Let's take this one, for example. I'll put it right here. And let's just have a listen. So this is fairly uninteresting on its own, but if we start substituting some of the chords, we might come up with something more interesting and something more unique and totally different chord progression based on this chord progression. So let's dive in and look here. Now, in the earlier video, we were looking at using chord substitutions, and this is something we can use here as well to change the character a bit and give it a bit more of an interesting feeling. Now, I recommend changing the chords to a chord with common notes. for example, 2 steps up or 2 steps down. So let's have a look at what we have to work with here. So say for example we want to change this chord and that chord. The easiest way, since this is an... Oops, sorry. The easiest way, since this is an F major, is to, for example, try the D minor one. So I'm just going to move it 2 steps down to the D. Now, this might be big jumps, but let's just give it a shot. I'll take this one also down to E minor. So we have switched both these ones 2 steps down on the scale. And now it sounds like this. And what we also might want to do is to switch it up an octave, for example. See what this sounds like in comparison. And there you have a brand new chord progression right there. Let's play around with it for a moment before moving on. And say, I don't personally like the feeling of the E minor here, so maybe I just want to go up to G. And then we have a chord progression that sounds like this. So that is how you can use chord substitutions to create more interesting and more unique chord progressions out of an existing chord progression. And I mean, this technique you can use for any chord and any chord progression, so just experiment and see what you come up with. Now, all of these chord progressions consist of only 4 chords. And while you can stretch them out and speed them up, for example, what if we want more than 4 chords? Let's look at some ways to extend our chord progressions. So let's, for example, use this one as an example, actually. Now, one way is to just repeat your chord progression twice with slight changes in the second round or the first round, for example. For example, we can substitute some of the chords in the repetition. So let's just copy this and let's have a listen to what it sounds like. Oh yeah, let's make sure the modulation is smooth too. I want to try to glue these together. Yeah, let's just fix that real quick. There we go. And here. That should do the trick for now. Now, let's get rid of that. Here. Now, say that I want these to be a little bit different, because after all, we're not just repeating a progression twice. I mean, that's what you're doing in general when you use a chord progression. You're kind of looping it. But what if we want all this to be one chord progression, for example? Now, what I could do is to change this. For example, move this one down a little bit. And now maybe I want to change this one to something different. For example, move it. It's in D minor now because we moved this down from F. What if I move this one up to F again? So it's only D minor in the first round. And then it just continues as usual. The result is something that sounds like this. And there you go. You have a brand new chord progression that is longer than 4 chords. So what I basically just did is that I moved and switched around some of these chords to just make the first repetition a little bit different than the second one. Now another way is to simply combine 2 chord progressions after one another. So let's hear what that sounds like. Let's just take 2 pretty random ones, like for example this one and say this one. I don't know what this will sound like, but let's give it a shot. So now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to just move these ones together. Let's see. Take away those ones. There we go. Move them together. Use the glue, and make sure the transition is going to be smooth here. And I have no idea what this is going to sound like, because I don't even know what these chord progressions are, but that's part of the fun with composing, because sometimes you come across like these happy accidents. Let's give this a listen, see what we've done. Bam, there you go. I mean, to me, this is a cool chord progression. This could end up as a pretty interesting track. And what I just did is that I took 2 of our existing chord progressions and just put them right after one another. And what we have now is an interesting 8 chord progression. Let me just do a little jam over it before we round off this video. And so on. So you get a feel for how you can come up with melodies over these chord progressions. And what I'm doing, I'm just improvising over them, and it's already sounding like fairly okay themes. So with some melodic work, like we've been looking at in the first chapter, and some clever use of chord progressions, you can quickly come up with some very interesting and good sounding themes. And you can also come up with your own chord progressions that you like and use the same techniques on them, maybe substituting some chords, adding 2 of them together, and so on. But I hope this gives you a good starting point, and I'll see you guys in the next video where we're going to have a look at how to use chords with 7th, 9th, and 13th note, for example, suspensions, and so on to enhance your harmony layers. I'll see you guys there.